Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The Prime Minister has described the collapse of the construction giant Carillion as regrettable, but says the taxpayer cannot be expected to bail it out. It was awarded £2 billion worth of government contracts last year, despite issuing a series of profit warnings.
Well, Labour say that there should be an investigation into why the government continued to give it work. The company went into compulsory liquidation this morning after talks to save it failed. And there could be profound implications for a range of UK public services, not to mention 20,000 job losses in the UK alone.
Well, Cabinet Office Minister David Lidington said due diligence was carried out.
The Department of Transport weighed everything up when it came to its decision. It obviously had available to it the information about the profits warnings, but it also had available to it the track record of Carillion as a successful provider to the public sector over many years under successive governments, and the confidence of the Carillion board that they were going to be able to come to an agreement with their lenders. Now, but the Department for Transport built in to its contracts a joint sector provision so that the other joint sector contracting partners are obliged by their contract to come forward and take on the share that was given to Carillion in this case if anything were to go wrong. So the public interest was properly protected by the Department for Transport.
Well, the Shadow Business Secretary told Sky News that there should now be an investigation into why the government continued to award contracts to Carillion after the company had issued profits warnings.
This firm issued 3 profit warnings, not just one, 3 profit warnings over the last 6 months. Yet even after those profit warnings were issued, government still handed new contracts, for example HS2 to Carillion. Now this contravened government advice and government policy to deem a company high risk if a profit warning was issued and to refrain or reconsider awarding new contracts. So we fully require an investigation into the conduct of the government on this matter.
Well, Carillion is the UK's second largest construction company. It has contracts to build and run hospitals, prisons, army barracks, army housing and schools. Current contracts include High-Speed Rail 2 and the electrification of the London to Corby line. Carillion provides facilities management to 875 schools as well as 50 prisons across the country. It also is the largest provider of facilities management to the MOD and a major provider to the NHS, providing services that affect over 3 million patients each year. In totality, Carillion employs 43,000 staff. That's across the globe, 20,000 of whom are employed in the UK. The company was once valued at £2 billion. In 2016, Carillion had a turnover of £5.2 billion, but it also had debts of £1.5 billion, £900 million worth of debt, plus a £600 million pensions deficit. Last year, it issued 3 profit warnings and its share price plummeted, leaving the company worth relatively a trifling sum, £61 million. With its collapse, there are questions over the company's current building contracts and the provision of major public sector services.
Well, joining me from central London's our city editor, Mark Kleinman, and also Tom Parmenter, who's at Midlands Metropolitan Hospital in the West Midlands, one of Carillion's big infrastructure projects. First to you, Mark. Mark, how could a company this big, with this much work, fail?
Corporate mismanagement, Jane. Carillion mispriced a number of key contracts on which it racked up huge losses. Back in September, it announced that it had lost £1.15 billion for the half year, and without the support of creditors, or in this case the efforts to secure financial support from the government, no company can sustain losses like that over the long term. It's interesting that the route that was chosen today wasn't that of appointing an administrator, it was to appoint a compulsory liquidator. So the official receiver has taken on this role, and part of their responsibilities is to conduct an investigation as an agent of the government's insolvency service, an investigation that will take place looking at the company's business dealings, its affairs, and the conduct of its directors. And there are going to be some very stern questions directed at the occupants of Carillion's boardroom, because there was quite a number of hedge funds that had been shorting or betting on the value of Carillion's shares falling since 2015. Rumours that at the time and ever since were dismissed by Carillion's directors as ill-founded gossip. One other key point to bring you that's emerged this morning is, Jane, that the banks which lent money to Carillion are actually facing losses which could total as much as £2 billion. Now, the discrepancy between that and the headline figure of debt that Carillion was carrying of £900 million or so can be explained by the fact that a lot of the money that the banks lent to Carillion was actually lent to subsidiary companies in the form of credit lines. So these losses are absolutely enormous. And also the Pension Protection Fund, which is now responsible for paying out retirement benefits to Carillion's pension scheme members, that's on the hook for a bill which could total £900 million. So we're talking about potentially £2.9 billion of exposures to these organisations for a company that in the end was worth just about £60 million.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Also, let's bring in Tom Parmenter now. Tom, the impact is going to be felt where you are. It's going to be one of the worst hit areas, it's thought.
Yeah, and I think all the talk of the political rows, the political fallout from this, and of hedge funds betting on Carillion's value. This is about the 19,000 employees plus in this country and more overseas, and the supply chain, which of course supplies all the materials and the goods and the services into the kind of big projects that Carillion do. One of them behind us, the Midland Metropolitan Hospital here in Smethwick in the West Midlands. This is a big new super hospital, 670 beds, serving 500,000 people in this part of the West Midlands. It is midway through the build. The contractors are back on site. The Carillion branding is all over this site, and they are back at work today, following that advice that was put out this morning. Just keep working, and we're working in the background on all the contingency plans as to what it means. The NHS Trust that relates to this particular hospital say that they are in negotiations with the Treasury in London and other organisations to make sure that this hospital does open its doors as scheduled in 2019 to patients. But these are the kind of big, complicated infrastructure projects that Carillion have been involved in. And of course, the staff trying to get on with plotting what happens next. They've not gone into administration, they've been liquidated, so a lot of questions that remain unresolved. We know that there will be a task force set up here in the West Midlands, probably centred on Wolverhampton, that will involve the Mayor of the West Midlands, Andy Street, and other partners, saying that they believe that many of the brilliant skills that are within the workforce at Carillion will be redeployed into other contractors, other people who take on the projects that are ongoing or in the pipeline. So I think there will be some hope there for some sections, certainly, of the Carillion workforce. I spoke to one senior figure within the company today who said that although it was not unexpected, this news, it still comes as a very significant shock.
OK, thanks very much there, Tom.
Well, how will, if at all, this affect our national infrastructure? Let's turn to the former, until recently, in fact, chairman of the National Infrastructure Commission, Lord Adonis. Andrew Adonis, welcome to you. What will be the impact, you think?
Well, there are a lot of contracts that now need to be renegotiated and work that has to go to other providers. And the question which people will be asking today is how good were the government's contingency arrangements? Because people have been able to see this coming for 6 months. I mean, we've had successive profits warnings. I think mistakenly the government continued to give work to Carillion even after those profits warnings, and I think big questions will have to be asked in due course about that and what value for money that represented for the taxpayer. But the immediate question is passing these contracts, these building contracts and these service contracts to other providers, or the state itself moving in to take them over. And my view is that it may well be best value for the taxpayer for the state to move in rather than simply handing these contracts to other private operators who of course will be able to demand a king's ransom because they're taking them on in an emergency condition with no notice.
Yeah, I mean, ideologically that would be quite a step for this government to take, wouldn't it?
Well, the job of the government is to protect the taxpayer and to do the right thing for public services, and they shouldn't let ideology stand in the way. Indeed, I think a big part of the reason we're in this mess is because the government, and particularly the Transport Secretary, Chris Grayling, have adopted a very ideological approach to failing private sector companies, and they've wanted to prop them up well beyond the time they should have done, rather than hand the business to the state, as should have happened in extremis.
It is easy, isn't it, to look at this and say, well, just because the hedge funds were shorting things from 2015 onwards, then everybody must have known that this was a failing company. The truth is, actually, there were still some wise folk this morning who felt that the banks might step in and provide some sort of rescue plan. It was still a viable business. Gazing into the crystal ball and knowing a massive outfit like this will fail is impossible.
Well, there are two different issues here. The first is whether it was sensible for the government to be giving more work to Carillion after the profits warnings.
Well, the Prime Minister's spokesman said only a couple of hours ago that this was a very small number of contracts post-profit warning.
Well, I think that just shows how far removed they are from the concerns of ordinary people. What the Prime Minister's spokesman calls a very small number of contracts are contracts worth several billions of pounds.
Well, many ordinary
so
people...
this is huge. This is huge business. But the first issue is whether it was right to give them those contracts. My view is it was wrong to give them the contracts because they become a high-risk company by the fact that they defaulted. The second issue, of course, is the existing work that they had even before those profits warnings. And there, clearly, what the government needed to do was contingency arrangements for transferring that work. And what's important is that they're not ideological about that. And if the best value for the taxpayer is for the state itself to move in, employ people, see that they're working and that projects are being delivered at least on an emergency basis, then they should do that.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is, many ordinary people, as you say, many ordinary people will not have heard of Carillion, but they'll have heard of companies like British Leyland. When the state ran that type of provision, they did it very, very badly.
Well, we're talking about an emergency step. We're not talking about a permanent arrangement. What should happen now is that the state should see that these services are provided at good value and efficiently now, because, of course, this company has gone into liquidation as of this morning.
But we will be on the hook indefinitely. You know how these things have a habit of creeping on and on and on.
Well, your question is exactly the kind of ideological approach that, unfortunately, has led us partly into this mess in the first place, which is because we're not prepared to see the state undertake its duty, which is to step in and see that services are provided when the private sector fails. Because it's not prepared to do that, what actually happens is you escalate the crisis in the private sector and we end up with a complete liquidation, which is the situation we're facing today. The parallel with British Leyland doesn't apply at all. British Leyland was not kept going as an emergency step to deliver contracts which had already agreed to. The state took over the company and started developing whole new car models and lines of business. That's very different.
No, I use it as an example people will remember to introduce the idea.
It's not a good example in this case. Well, what you've got at the moment is...
Let me at least offer some clarification. To introduce the idea that perhaps there are certain circumstances in certain sectors with the idea of competition where companies will tender for a contract. And, you could argue sometimes they tender unrealistically and end up not being able to make a profit on it. That may be what's happened to Carillion here. But the intention is to provide best value for the taxpayer. And I'm sure the government, and I'm sure governments you've served in the past, will point to examples of where that collaboration between the private and public sector has worked very successfully for all parties.
Yeah, but it must be on the basis of successful companies and proper competition. And what we're dealing with here clearly is a failing company. And if this work is simply handed out to other private companies without any competition, then of course they'll have to be paid a king's ransom for it, and the taxpayer will end up with a very large bill. So, I don't think harking back to the 1970s is particularly helpful in dealing with what is a real crisis here in January 2018, and we need to see that we stand by the taxpayer and do the right thing.
Andrew Adonis, thanks very much.
Where we find ourselves almost addressing head-on one of the things that worries me the most about everything, really. The stuff that we should know more about and should talk about more is a bit dull and dry until days like today, when you have no choice but to talk about it. If I'd tried to launch, an informative and exciting conversation with you about Carillion, about one of the largest recipients of government contracts for the outsourcing of services that would, in many cases, previously have been done within the public sector. Well, you can tell there, you've already fallen asleep with services that would previously have been done within the public sector. And yet today we realise what happens when people like me and you don't keep a close eye on proceedings. I don't know what the answer is to that problem. I mean, professionally speaking, it's almost an existential issue, isn't it? I mean, you know and I know that in terms of... this is probably a bit too honest of me, is it? I have an easier life if I come on air and today, for example, we could talk about fly tipping, which we've all got a reaction to, we've all got a view on. I also happen to be oddly fascinated by it, but it's something that the producer generally doesn't let me discuss because it's like the definition of, yeah, bums on seats, lots of phones ringing, but are we really going to do anything interesting? And yet there's also that part of me that knows, well, actually, that's everyone's going to have a view. We've all got something to say. We could talk about the fella, the leader of UKIP, whose job's under threat apparently because his girlfriend's not racist enough or something. I may have misunderstood that story, but UKIP being UKIP, who knows? We could talk about that. Everyone's got a view, something exciting to say. Is Donald Trump, talk about him most days. But this is the kind of stuff I know we should be talking about. Maybe I get a free pass because this is a phone-in programme, so I am not supposed to be dedicating a significant swathe of my professional expert efforts to keeping you informed about stuff that no one else is informing you about. That historically is the role of the BBC. Not passing the buck, just thinking out loud. The BBC possibly should have been reporting problems with Carillion for the last year or more. You know what the problem is, though? They probably were, just with the profile and the status that a very dry, potentially dull business story gets. This has been all over the business pages. I've been trawling through cuts all morning. This has been all over the business pages. And it has come as no surprise whatsoever to people who watch these things more closely than perhaps we do. And that's why we end up feeling so baffled and befuddled, perhaps. Isn't it? Let's park another bus straight away. Let's not turn this into I want the Tories awful. I bet Labour were fronting cash to Carillion like it was going out of fashion as well. I think they've got some PFI contracts on the hospitals, which was very much a Blair era invention. Everything now breaks down like a football match. I know you're getting bored of me saying this, but if the evidence stops massing up, then I'll stop saying it. It's almost as if, what happened at the weekend? What was the idea that you can't criticise? Yeah, that was it. Yesterday on Twitter, I criticised Donald Trump and Jeremy Corbyn. This is a little bit like crossing the streams in Ghostbusters. I hope that cultural reference isn't lost on you. People can't compute the fact. They think that if you condemn Donald Trump, then you must fancy Diane Abbott and be a fully paid up member of the Jeremy Corbyn fan club. Then you criticise Jeremy Corbyn and, well, hang on a minute, what about... This whataboutery is so stultifying, isn't it? You know and I know that the political opinions of intelligent people will borrow from almost all major political parties. You might like the cut of Dominic Grieve's jib on justice-related issues, legal-related issues, while simultaneously recognising that a Labour politician that you like has also done good stuff. But they don't let us live like that anymore. Maybe it's because if we did start recognising the common interest, the national interest, then... the current crop of politicians would be rendered even more ridiculous than they currently are. I don't know. You can tell. I'm puzzled by this story. I'm also puzzled by the best way in which we should examine it together. So this is astonishing, isn't it? July the 10th of last year, by which I mean 6 months ago. It's 2017. A profit warning was issued. Conspiracy theorists look away now. The reason why HSBC, while still in government hands, got rid of... Well, no. Yeah, no, it is actually... It's not quite the conspiracy that some people think it is. So HSBC, while still owned largely by the taxpayer, got rid of all its Carillion shares. Now, the intelligent thing to say at this point is, well, of course it did, because they'd issued a profit warning. Right? Anyone who hung on to their Carillion shares is taking a bath at the moment, as I believe the parlance has it. So whoever was running HSBC on behalf of the government saw this profit warning and ditched the shares, right? The problem with that is that the government didn't, essentially. The government, a week after this profit warning was issued, shares went down that day 39%. The chief executive resigned, okay? A week after that profit warning, that 39% collapse in the share price, Carillion and a French construction company won a £1.4 billion contract to work on HS2. I'm a bear of very little brain. I do no longer preface conversations like this one by saying, I'm no expert on business. I think it's become clear in recent years that there are no real experts on business. There's lucky people and unlucky people, informed people and uninformed people. If a profit warning is issued, you jettison your shares. The share price then goes down by 39%. If you've got the stomach for a bit of risk-taking and you want to back the notion that the share price has to come up again, not least because the government's not showing any sign of turning its back on this outfit despite the profit warning, then you don't ditch your shares. You hang on to them despite them going down in value in the hope that they'll go back up again. In this case, they won't now. Liquidation has removed that prospect from the horizon. One day after that £1.4 billion HS2 rail link was announced, Carillion won a £158 million contract from the Ministry of Defence to provide catering, retail and leisure, hotel and mess services at 233 military facilities. I don't understand that, my friends. I'm really sorry if you tune into this programme in the slightly warped hope of having an explainer or a bit of light shone into the dark corners of our country. I can't quite... I always try and look for a personal equivalent. It's a little bit simplistic, but imagine if my listening figures had gone down by 40% and then 2 massive job offers came in a week later. It's not impossible, I suppose, but it's highly unlikely, isn't it? 39% collapse in the share price, an actual profit warning from the company and the resignation of the chief executive followed a week later by a £1.4 billion contract. And then guess what happened in September? Yeah, you're right. Wow. Another profit warning. This one followed 5 weeks later by a massive contract from Network Rail for a contract to electrify the railway line that connects London to Corby. A week after that, another profit warning, followed 3 days later by a £12 million contract for schools. I don't know what this means. Does it mean that the government was giving them contracts in the hope of shoring off the financial collapse that the share price decline spoke of? So the government are looking at this and going, oh lordy, Carillion, they're kind of running everything. They're doing everything that the public sector used to do. They've got hospitals, they're involved in schools, they're supposed to be keeping our prisons clean and tidy. We can't let this company go under. Let's give them another £1.4 billion contract just to keep the wolf from the door. That's not enough. All right, let's give them £158 million for the Ministry of Defence. Not enough, boss. There's been another profits warning. All right, how about electrifying the railway line from London to Corby? Can we give them money to do that? Yeah, we probably could. All right. A week after that, still not working. Another profit warning. 12 million quid for schools. 3 days after the last profit warning. Yeah, we can do that. This is all true, and it's all on the record, and it all adds up to yet more evidence of a real crisis in journalism in this country. The interim chief executive said after that 12 million quid schools building contract, we continue to retain the confidence of key customers despite the group's current challenges. Oh, riddle me this. 0345 60 973. 3 things. We're not doing it as Brexit, despite the fact that the chief executive warned in December 2016 that Brexit was hitting them very, very hard, because it gives them a get-out clause, it gives them a fig leaf, and it possibly even allows the government off the hook. Number 2, we're not getting party political about it, because I genuinely believe, and unless you can provide some very compelling evidence to the contrary, I will continue to believe that this could just as easily have happened under the last lot as this lot. So no Brexit, no party politics, and absolutely no gloating. I don't care how paid up your subscription to the Jeremy Corbyn fan club may be, and the Labour Party will, I think, make much political capital out of this, with some justification. I think our thoughts, as people who are concerned about the national interest, should be with everyone who's worried about their livelihood now. I'm told that Carillion had a 120-day delay on a lot of their invoice raising. So if you were a medium to small-sized company that was subcontracting the work that Carillion subcontracted from the government, you might be worried about surviving. The last thing you want is some crypto-Marxist popping up on the telly, high-fiving his bearded mates and cheering about the fact that your business might go under next week or next month or next year. Then there's the people actually on the official payroll, if you will, the people who are now worried about their livelihoods. There's nothing to celebrate here. And oddly, on a personal note, The Guardian reported this morning that the chairman of Carillion, a chap called Philip Green, but not that one, not the one with the yachts, was an advisor to Prime Minister Theresa May on corporate responsibility. So the Guardian generally being a fairly reputable news source, I tweeted that out and had my first ever sort of caution, my first ever whistle. Actually, it's not my first ever, but first in a very long time, from 10 Downing Street, saying this isn't true. He was dispensed with as an advisor to Theresa May in December of 2016. So now I'm trying to find out why. Why did she get rid of him? And as an advisor, did she know back then that there was dodgy stuff set to emerge from Carillion? And I've been unable to find the announcement of him no longer being an advisor to Theresa May. He was also an advisor on similar issues to David Cameron. What a tangled web. What a blinking mess. Anybody got a detangler? 0345 6060 973. When I'm doing a girl's hair, sometimes I need to use this special spray. If they've gone native for a couple of weeks in the summer holidays, their hair is like a bird's nest. There's this special spray that you can buy. A detangler. You squirt it in their hair, get the old hairbrush out, and Bob's your uncle. I need a detangler today. Because I've got 3 thoughts, and then we'll hit a break, and then we'll take your calls. The first is an adage I hadn't heard before, which is nobody ever gets sacked for hiring IBM or buying IBM. Now, this means that once a sort of corporate stagnation has set in a business environment, you never take a risk. You see it in the appointments of chief executives. You know, you see it in the appointment of non-executive directors. It's a very, very small pool of people that are drawn from. And the only qualification for the job really seems to be that you haven't been involved in a scandal. Actually, that doesn't exclude you from some of these things. But the adage about IBM means if you don't take a risk, you'll never get sacked. IBM have provided computers to all the other offices in our empire, so if we're going to buy new computers, we'll go to IBM. They might not be the best available, but it's like reputational insurance. Do you see what I mean? So is that part of the Carillion problem? Question number 2, I'm very troubled by the notion of outsourced contracts. And it seems to me possible, and we'll explore this, that you could work for Carillion while not actually working for Carillion. So that while the share price and the shareholders would benefit from a contract given to Carillion, the people actually putting in a shift to do the work required under that contract are not going to get the protections of full-time employment. I could be wrong on that, but that seems very much to be the way of the world, doesn't it? There's another story involving Amazon drivers getting compensation because they are employers, despite the best efforts of big businesses to kind of have a payroll of 0, just a series of subcontractors. So we're looking at that question, and we're looking at the who does the actual work question, and then we're doing what we always do on this programme. It seems more important on a day like today, not less important, to talk to people who've been directly affected. I will keep the ship sailing of the big questions, the political questions, the systemic issues, but I want you to have a platform as well, just to get it out there. I don't know that it will achieve anything, but if you're frightened this morning about your future as a direct result of the Carillion collapse, then there will always be a platform for you here. You know that. If you want to use it today, the number remains the same, 0345 6060 973. I'll leave you with one paragraph, because this isn't blaming or in any way crediting Brexit with responsibility for the Carillion collapse. It's just a little illustration that you'll indulge me on of yet more evidence that I'm right about everything. The biggest winner from July's Carillion share price crash was hedge fund manager Marshall Wace, whose co-founder, Sir Paul Marshall, was a major backer of the Leave campaign in the Brexit referendum. Rarely do we feel more like the mushrooms of British society than on a day like today. Keep us in the dark and just cover us in manure every now and then in the hope that we'll continue growing. Explain Carillion to me from your perspective, either as an observer of such matters, as a employee of Carillion, as a subcontractor perhaps, who is potentially facing ruin as a result of this liquidation, or indeed from any other perspective you please. It's 10:23. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Ahmed is in Walthamstow. Ahmed, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello, mate.
Second call. James, I was just going to say how worried I was about the jobs.
Oh, I just need to make a correction. I got my HSBCs and my RBSs mixed up. Government has the RBS shares, not the HSBC shares. So HSBC shed those shares, presumably after talks and after the profit warning. RBS, I think, are still on the Carillion creditors list. Just for the record, Ahmed, it's nothing to do with what you said. I always like a hashtag fact check. Yeah. Carry on.
Okay. Yeah, so I was just going to say how worried I was for the jobs of all the poor innocent people who get caught up in these type of situations, and I absolutely would love for their jobs to be protected. But when you were reeling off the news releases and then the subsequent winning of contracts and then the impact of that on share prices, it suddenly dawned on me that there could be something else at play here, and I sort of put my conspiracy theory.
Oh, well, mate, not at 24 minutes after 10. We don't need it. Go on then. Let me hear it before I start shooting you down.
Yeah, no, well, you can shoot me down after. I don't mind, right? Well, so basically, I mean, if you think about it, there's a press release that says the business is doing really bad. The share price gets impacted slightly, and then the following day there's a
39%.
Yeah, so then there's it's a cumulative effect, I guess. So, but yeah, the share price gets impacted, and then the subsequent day you hear that they've just won another big contract, and then so suddenly there's a little flip again, and we see a bit of an upside. And so what started to dawn on me when you started to reel off all the press releases was that, these press releases are thought out. The audits and all the stuff that all the accountancy firms do, they're all undertaken over a period of time. This doesn't happen just in as easy a way as some people would like us to believe.
But sometimes you and I, and everybody else who's not part of these, we presume that there's some sort of mystical magic circle going on and that these people are possessed of sinister superpowers. In my experience, they're just a bunch of lemons who talk. They're all very plausible people. They're kind of like the UKIP, if you... Or no, not the current UKIP, the old UKIP of British politics, in that they talk undiluted hogwash, but no one ever calls them out on it.
Well, I think you might be right in some respects, Jane, but I remember working for a business that was going to get bought out by Carillion. I was on a local government project. Yeah. And we knew that Carillion were looking at our business to purchase, and we were working on a local government contract, right? So the machine, the mighty machine, the cogs that are in place, they work in a certain way, and I think it might just be a good old case of, we can make some money here, let's keep doing it and carry on doing it until we get stopped, basically.
Well, you say that, and I have to, in support, I suspect, of your theory, I have to remind my listeners that months before the £600 million accounting crisis last year that cost the company dear and led to that resignation by the chief executive, they changed the rules. They changed the wording of their pay policy to make it harder for investors to claw back bonuses paid to executives. So they reckon that about 4 million quid's worth of bonuses was secretly protected by Carillion just months before that accounting crisis emerged. And I'll add to that the biggest winner from that share price crash was a bloke who used his millions to fund the Leave campaign in the Brexit referendum. Hedge fund Marshall Wace, whose co-founder was a major backer of the Leave campaign in the Brexit referendum, according to today's Guardian. In fact, lots of hedge funds have made tens of millions of pounds by quietly betting that Carillion would run into financial distress. These are the days, aren't they? These are the days where you wonder whether actually something really big is changing. Sorry, Ahmed, I'm moving on, but loads of people have made money out of this, which means they saw it coming. They're not geniuses. Oh, dear. I've got a couple of phone lines if you can contribute from a perspective of understanding or experience, because at this point I have neither. Charlie's in Southampton. Charlie, what would you like to say?
Yeah. Hi, James. How are you doing?
Very well, thanks. What's on your mind?
Well, there are a few things. I mean, first of all, let's talk about competency. A long time ago, I'm well retired.
Yes.
A long time ago, I was taught something called the Peter Principle.
Yes.
And the first Peter Principle...
School, keep your language friendly.
No, don't worry. I will keep it friendly. Don't worry about that. The people are promoted to the level of their own incompetence.
Yes.
As you get one promotion too far. The other one is...
Speaking of competence, would you mind talking into your phone, rather than some distance from it?
No.
Yes, like that, Charlie. Yes, that's much more competent. Carry on.
Sorry about that. I thought I'd already done that. The second principle that Mr. Peters came up with was that given a sufficient period of time, an organisation will appoint as its head the person least competent to do it. And that is probably what has happened at Carillion. As regards the contract side of things, I did actually work for an organisation that took on some government contracts for building maintenance and things like that. And what they do is that they bid for a break-even point. So they don't expect to make a profit on the contract. What you then do is you anything over and above the contract, you charge a lot of money for.
I had a bit of a crash course in this practice after the Grenfell Tower tragedy. Actually, the notion of ramping up your costs after the original bid has been accepted. But of course, the bureaucrats, the civil servants, call them what you will, who oversee these processes, are supposed to be policed by the Cabinet Office, and the Cabinet Office has every right to sort of label a company high risk, and then you get a Crown representative should be appointed. Officials should reduce where possible the extent to which the strategic supplier is given additional work under the terms of and none of that happened in this case, and I don't know why. Do you think that Ahmed might be right in that they thought, look, it's having a bit of a wobble, none of us really understand business on this scale, if we keep throwing them enormous contracts, surely they'll pull through?
It's actually when somebody read out, or I heard on the news elsewhere this morning, the three companies that had merged to make Carillion, I thought to myself, my God, that was absolute madness. Some things get too big.
Well, yes, they do, and they stretch themselves into areas they've got no experience of, but that... I don't know. There's a little element in your analysis of it not really being anybody's fault. It obeys these.
It is definitely someone's fault. Well, I mean, I think you can look at the financial agency, whatever they call themselves.
I've got to go to the news. I'm not delaying the news for your description of the financial agency. It's 10:30. And you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I wouldn't have got a bee in my bonnet about this if it wasn't for Number 10 getting in touch this morning to ask that I correct something that I tweeted about Philip Green, the chairman of Carillion, being an advisor on corporate responsibility to the Prime Minister Theresa May. They were keen that I explain that role ceased to exist in December 2016, but I'm struggling to find any announcement of it until April 2016, I beg your pardon, until April of last year, when Margot James made a very carefully worded statement explaining that Philip Green no longer held the position of advisor to the Prime Minister on corporate social responsibility. I'm not sure it was ever announced, so I possibly was a little bit too trusting when I made that correction. I'm happy to clarify if more details emerge. And the reason why people were calling attention to Philip Green's role as an advisor to Theresa May back then actually wasn't because of Carillion's imminent problems, from which hedge funds were estimated to have made a cool £80 million on the day of the first collapse, and tens of millions more since. They were worried about Carillion's involvement in alleged blacklisting of trades union officials. So in many ways, this story speaks to just about everything. It may prove to be the most emblematic of the national pageant of any story that we see this year. So what you have is a massive private sector company divvying up huge amounts of money for shareholders and chief execs. Just months before that original accounting crisis saw 600 million quid wiped off the value of the company overnight. The chief executive and some of his key colleagues changed the wording of the pay policy to protect their £4 million bonuses. Hedge funds made £80 million immediately after that original share price collapse. The biggest winner was a hedge fund co-founded by a major backer of the Leave campaign in the Brexit referendum. That suggestion that some of the people who bankrolled Leave, I think the fellow that runs Terra Firma, the guy that bought AMI, Guy Hands, didn't he say that it would be very good for him financially, Brexit, but it would be very bad for everybody else? He also backed it. Here you have someone who backed it and indeed bankrolled it, making a killing out of it, while 43,000 people are going to be wondering what their jobs may hold, or even whether they'll exist in the future. So 80 million quid to the hedge funds, 4 million quid to the chief execs, God knows how much to the rest of the shareholders up until that collapse. and the fellow who was chairman of the outfit was still officially an advisor until the Prime Minister, until, well, April of last year at the latest, and December of 2016 at the earliest. And yet, you know, I suppose tomorrow we'll be back to suggesting... I'll tell you how we should solve Carillion. I've got it. We should abolish foreign aid and use all the money saved to bail out Carillion. I'd laugh, but that'll probably be in a newspaper column before the end of the week. Teresa is in Rochester. Teresa, what's going on?
Yeah, laugh I nearly did, James. I think you've just given a really good description of the times that we're living through,
yes,
and some reasons why we need to make fundamental changes. Look, I used to work in a prison. I was an education manager. And in my first week there, some stationery I'd ordered turned up.
Yes. And
I phoned Carillion and asked them to pick it up. 2 hours later, a bill for £50 landed on my desk with, and followed in quick succession, a phone call from the governor giving me an ear-rolling and telling me we don't use Carillion. So I thought, well, hang on a minute. In my induction, I was told, you know, that's what they were doing. He said, look, we can't afford to use them. Now, that's an example of what happens. It's a tiny example, but actually you can write it as large as you like, right up to the hedge fund.
Yes.
These big companies go in at 0% and screw everybody else once they get the contract, including workers, including the people that they're working for, and the quality of the services that they're providing. And it's about an obsession that somehow the private sector is better than anything the public sector can do.
I hesitate to use the word, but that is ideological.
Yes, it absolutely is. And we need to change our ideology. Look, the government can't employ everybody to do everything. I understand that. You know, I'm a local Labour councillor. I would like things to be better than they are. I'm in favour of nationalisation of the railways and public utilities for good reasons. The good reasons are that the private sector are making a terrible mess of this, and a few people at the top are raking all of the money while the rest of us suffer.
And we can sit here staring into the ether, trying to work out how, when so much evidence accrues that there has to be a better way. I don't want to go back to full public ownership any more than I want to live in a completely neoliberal world of exclusively private ownership. There has to be a balance. That is... we're never going to understand the people who refuse to recognise that simple truth.
Yeah. To all those people who tell me they know about business, they're not doing a very good job, are they?
I think that's a fair conclusion, Teresa.
This is about contract monitoring.
Yes.
Look, if we give my money and your money to private companies, then there should be a set of principles about the way the workforce are treated, about the quality of the work, about the reporting. That just doesn't happen. In Rochester, we've seen this. Look, we've seen the Secure Training Centre holding some of the most vulnerable kids in prison go down with G4S. We've seen our patient ambulance transport service taking people from home to hospital for non-urgent care run by G4S get into a terrible mess. Asking questions, scrutinising these decisions as a councillor, I'm told we got the commissioning wrong. Well, it's the contract. And this is a story that is heard.
No, unintentionally you have helped me understand something, because when you turn around and say, why are you still supporting this notion when all of the evidence suggests that it's wrong, they say, no, the principle is correct, we just have the wrong people enacting it.
Yes, and you know, I have to take responsibility for this, and so do you, and so do all the listeners. This is our services, this is our country. You know, we haven't succeeded in saying that we want a better way.
But if you know as well as I do,
shout louder about it.
If you can't blame it on immigration, the European Union or foreign aid, then 80% of the British media isn't interested until it's too late, like today.
Well, you know, it can't keep on being too late. There are 20,000 people in the UK today who are worried about their jobs.
43,000 worldwide, for anyone confused by that. Yes.
And I send a message of solidarity and support to them. I want them to have better security than that. I know that they're running local hospitals. I know that they're in local schools. I've met them face-to-face in prisons when I was working alongside them. And I know that the constraints of the stupid situation they were in were preventing them from doing the good job that they want to do, because it's shareholders shareholders who are calling the shots. Now, if people are prepared to put up with this constantly...
And that's the point about the public sector, is that it has to be ring-fenced from some of the realities of business. You have to guarantee jobs and services in, for example, a prison or a school. You can't leave them subject to the vagaries of the free market, because... And equally, it's very hard to do a contract. What if loads of people go out and commit a crime, or what if nobody does? This notion that you agree a contract up front about something as fluid and variable as prisons it's palpably absurd.
Absolutely.
And yet it's normal.
And mendaciously, the reason why people like the fellow who bankrolled Brexit are involved, because actually they know that they can go as wrong as they like, make loads of money, and in the end we'll all have to bail them out.
Because that's short selling, where you essentially bet upon a business buckling and make a profit out of a collapse in the share price. And if it turns out that lots and lots of companies suffer similarly, once Brexit happens, it's unlikely to happen as much before. And lots and lots of these hedge funds clean up, everyone will still be pointing over there saying, get cross about foreign aid, don't get cross about that bloke who bankrolled Brexit being the biggest winner, or at least the company he founded being the biggest winner from that share price crash back in July, which did absolutely nothing to stop the government from handing them 1 week later a £1.4 billion contract to work on HH2. The following day, 158 million quid from the Ministry of Defence for catering services at 233 military facilities. September, another profit warning was followed 5 weeks later by an award from Network Rail for a contract to electrify railway lines between London and Corby. And a week after that, the company put out another profit warning. That's 3 in 3 months, and got 12 million quid's worth of schools building contracts. I like Teresa's call a lot because it gave me an overview and an experience from the ground of how this company, Carillion, has impacted upon the reality of your daily life, your employment, your livelihood, your ability to provide the services that the company has been contracted to do. So far, if I had to put together a thumbnail sketch, I'd probably reach for this, which has been tweeted, a very good Twitter account actually called Very British Life, that you should follow. Alex is as witty as he is waspish and wise. He writes, the Carillion situation was caused by a large company being encouraged to underquote to win government contracts with the hope of a future upturn in the economy. The management would reap the exaggerated rewards. It's a major part of the austerity measures. And of course, the godfather of the austerity measures is now getting 600 grand a year for 1 day's work a week from one of the biggest investment funds in the country, BlackRock, which holds a massive stake in Uber. He also happens to edit the London Evening Standard, so expect their coverage of some of these stories to be rather different from mine. Just indulge me for a moment, will you? It was my birthday on Saturday, and some people who listen to the programme were kind enough to mark it. I can't thank everyone who sent a card. I'm sorry, there's too many. But I can say thank you to Darren Christian for the chocolates. I can say thank you to Ruben, and I'll get the name of this company right. I'll double-check it first. I think it's Mr. Cakey Bakey, who sent me an amazing cake. A kind of cake, I struggled to get it home. I had to swap arms, it was so heavy. Shared it with the neighbours, Ruben. It was absolutely delicious. Thank you so much. But if I had to pick a favourite this year, Ali sent me a Star Wars decanter, like the helmet of a stormtrooper that you pour your booze into. So thank you very, very much to Ali for that, and everyone else who was kind enough to mark it. Let's just say that if things carry on like this, then in approximately 400 years' time, I might get as many cards and gifts from listeners as Steve Allen does on his birthday every year. Just looking at the graph, the growing number of people kind and generous enough to... You really, really, really don't have to. And it leaves me a little bit uncomfortable when you do. But that Star Wars helmet and those chocolates and that cake, and the book off Emma, actually, the Homo Sapiens book that I've been meaning to read for ages. Thank you. 10:51 is the time. Back to Carillion. How can stuff like this happen, given that from the outside looking in, it seems both avoidable and egregious, but it happens, and it seems to happen again and again and again, and all I've got is the ideological argument. There is a belief, call it neoliberalism, call it rampant capitalism, call it what you will. There is a belief that everything is better off in the hands of the private sector. And whether that belief is informed by a sincere understanding of the issues, or whether it is informed by the knowledge that the more is in the pockets of the private sector, the more money will make its way into the pockets of people who are already wealthy, that is how shares work, then I don't know. I just don't know. What I do know is that this is the kind of thing we should be manning the barricades about and getting furious about, but it isn't. I'm not joking when I say just start the countdown now to someone saying we should bail out Carillion with all the money that we currently spend on foreign aid. Start the clock. 10:52. John's in Bristol. John, what would you like to say?
Morning, James. All right?
All good, mate. What's on your mind?
Well, firstly, you can't go offering foreign aid money to Carillion. That's already earmarked for what? The NHS and schools.
Old people's heating bills.
That's it.
Food banks.
So that's spent 3 times over. So
New socks. New socks for the whole country. Carry on, John. So stop popping the balloons, mate, and let them float away with truth attached to the little strings dangling beneath them.
Exactly. But this is a tragedy, and like you, I'm no expert on any of it. I'm waking up this morning and seeing the same with everyone else, that apparently there's 20,000 people in this country who are now questioning their jobs and livelihood.
Yeah.
But
and more, because a lot of little companies, and I'd quite like to hear from small to medium-sized companies who subcontract from the subcontractors, with a little bit being creamed off at every turn. That is the nature. That's what we've built over the last 30 years, isn't it?
Well, it is, and it's criminal, really. And the question that has to be asked seriously now is the government, in seemingly the face of quite serious alarm bells, continue to give these massive projects to them.
But who else could they give them to? I don't know if that's a stupid question. That's why I like the old adage. In fact, you know, I've just remembered a mate of mine was bidding for some business that put him up against IBM last summer. I must give him a ring and see how he got on. Because that old line about nobody ever gets sacked for buying IBM, that might explain some of it. It would be, I think, illegal under EU state aid laws for the government to deliberately siphon money into these outfits in the hope of keeping them afloat. So maybe Carillion just gets all the gigs because they already had all the gigs, and there's no really sinister explanation there. It's more cock-up than conspiracy.
Well, perhaps, but doesn't it go back to that thing of too big to fail? And that's where their idea of this neoliberal free market ideology all sorts of falls apart, because it applies to the likes of you and me. If we start a business and it fails, it's because we've run it incompetently or there wasn't a call for our service. But
well, you can say that, John. If I ever run a company that fails, it will definitely be because we're spending too much money on foreign aid.
Well, get it all back. We've taken back control. We don't need to keep spending that money on foreign aid, do we?
No one's going to get into trouble for this, are they? No, I mean, occasionally one of them loses a knighthood but hangs on to his castle.
But you're right. The people who ultimately are to blame for this won't be the ones who ever suffer. They'll go to the next company and CEO that, or sit on a non-executive board of something else, still taking bonuses. And the likes of the poor people who this is no making of theirs, they just turn up and they work and do their job, are the ones who this morning are looking, going, well, what's going to happen to us? And it happens time and time again, and it just proves that this neoliberal free market capitalist fantasy, it works for the few and not the most. And
sounding a little bit jezza there, John. A little bit jezza.
I was trying to keep it under wraps.
I love it because you changed it. You changed it from most to few. It's for the many, not the few, and you changed it to what did you? Busted.
Line.
Yeah. Well, you know, I'm not jumping on that particular boat yet. Although, as all the other boats continue to sink, it's not hard to see why more and more people are drawn to Jeremy Corbyn's the simple bits of his message, which
I agree with you. It is a simplistic view, and I myself, I live in the real world. I work for a capitalist industrial company.
So we all do, and there are many areas in which there's nothing wrong with that, and it's preferable because somebody has to take the risk, and if you're going to take the risk of setting up a company like this one, then the rewards should accrue at the top of the people who've exposed themselves to risk. But hospitals and schools and prisons, transport infrastructure, water companies, energy companies, they don't seem to me to fit into that model quite as neatly, and that's the fundamental problem of our age politically, isn't it?
It is, and the failure when it does happen you don't see there's no repercussion for that.
Can I run something by you?
Yeah, of course.
Talking about all of this, all right, I always get a little bit wary when this happens, especially at weekends. I think I worked out Jeremy Hunt this weekend.
Oh God.
He's actually doing a brilliant job, because the job he's been tasked with is not to run the NHS brilliantly. Because I was sitting there thinking, how can he... I mean, reportedly Theresa May wanted to move him along, but he refused to go. I don't know if that's true. But if you try and work out, how can somebody widely regarded by every doctor and nurse I've ever spoken to, which by all means won't be everyone in the country, as presiding over a disaster. We've got a story today about medical students filling gaps in the understaffed NHS. Yeah. He's alienated an entire generation of future doctors, currently junior doctors, as we know. Well, how can he still be getting a pat on the back? Answer is, you mug. Not you, mate, me. I'm the mug. Answer is the job he is being rewarded for is not the job you think that he's being given. He's not there to turn the NHS into the pride of Britain. He's there to soften it up.
Well, that's the theory I sort of came to myself.
Chomsky-esque, but in terms of actually why he hasn't gone, you take it to the next level and say because he's doing what they want him to do. And a key part of that job is firefighting. It's getting rid of the criticisms and the questions from people like me, which he's very, very good at. You don't sound that impressed. You beat me to it.
No, I
don't know why I bother, John. I don't know why I bother, mate.
I think he's absolutely softening the NHS up for
and even if he isn't, whatever it is he is doing, which seems to be completely at odds with what you and I would like him to be doing, whatever it is he is doing, they're really, really pleased with. So you're welcome to insert another description that isn't involved a Noam Chomsky-esque analysis of a future privatisation, but it has to be something that he's doing well, because what he's not doing well is waiting lists, operations, morale, transparency, explanation and patient satisfaction. He's not doing any of those things well, so you have to ask yourself, what is he doing well? I suppose the other alternative is that there's nobody in the cabinet, or indeed in the Tory ranks, less incompetent than him. Mark's in Nebworth. Mark, I've only got a minute. Is it going to be good?
Yeah, James, first of all, I used to work for Carillion, so my sympathies are with those people whose jobs are now at risk.
Everybody should be, but it's
okay.
Helpful to remind us. Thank you.
I'm also a shareholder, so I personally going to lose money out of it. Yeah. But there are some points to make. First of all, in relation to Brexit, Carillion's business was focused in the UK, Canada and the Middle East. So the Brexit argument doesn't hold water.
Well,
also,
it was the chief executive that made it. But as I've said, we're going to deny him the opportunity to use it as a fig leaf. And he made it in December 2016, but we'll let that pass.
Okay, in Balfour Beatty, another company engaged in similar enterprises.
Are they bigger? Because everyone keeps saying Carillion's the second biggest. Is Balfour Beatty the biggest?
The honest answer, James, I don't know.
Nor do I, mate. Nothing wrong in admitting that. Yeah, carry on.
It's certainly a sizable company, but that was on the point it collapsed and it got turned around, as did Tesco's. And in relation to the latest contracts...
But they never went into liquidation, did they?
No, they didn't go into liquidation, but they were in trouble at the time.
Yes.
And the final point is that the latest contracts were awarded to multiple companies on the basis that if one of the nominated companies went bust, then the other companies would step up. So there's no cost to the public.
I'm not quite sure what you've told me, and then that's probably my fault for not concentrating enough.
The contract was awarded to
three
companies, and it was awarded on the basis that if one of those companies went bust or was unable to complete its work, then the other companies would step up and complete the work, so there would be no cost.
And are you saying that is going to happen, or isn't?
That's the way that the contract was written.
So what are the other two companies, then?
I don't know.
OK. Until I do know, I'll take that under advisement, if I may, Mark. Thank you. 11 o'clock is the time. I've learnt a lot. Thank you. I'm going to carry on with this because we're on a bit of a voyage of discovery. Other stories that have tickled my fancy today include the report on alcohol, on drinking booze. For the first time since school, I've actually got something interesting to say about alcohol because I've changed my habits quite profoundly, and no one's more shocked than I am. I quite like the growing tension between David Lammy and Sadiq Khan, ordinarily on similar sides of most political arguments, but very much eyeing each other up from opposite sides of the fence on the question of stop and search. But I'm also drawn to an article written by, for my money, one of the finest young journalists in the country, one of the best journalists of his generation, who you've probably seen on Sky News. I had the pleasure of working with him over at Newsnight at the BBC, a chap called Lewis Goodall, who lost his granddad last month and wrote an article about it. And specifically, given that we're talking about the free market in the context of Carillion and the growing sense among people who retain the power of deep thinking, which is not an insult, it really isn't, it's just a description. Most of what's going on in politics on both sides of the Atlantic can only really be explained by people giving up on actually thinking about stuff. As we think about Carillion and the tentacles of free market ideology that seem to be now reaching into every corner of our societies, in Britain and America, not in continental Europe, oddly, funerals pose a really big problem. And Lewis wrote an incredibly moving piece, which you'll have seen me retweet over the weekend if you were around. explaining the shock and the unhappiness that can follow, especially if you're on your uppers financially. We've touched on this before, but we've never really got to the bottom of it. So I'm keen to return your attention to that story before 1 o'clock as well. But we'll crack on with Carillion for a little bit longer, because I'm trying to understand it. 0345 6060973 is the number that you need. David is in Epsom. David, what would you like to say?
Morning, James. I'm glad you've carried on with this, because it makes me really angry, and people will think that's quite exaggerated, but I work in the construction industry. The first thing people need to look at is how many small businesses will really suffer from this as well, not just the direct staff. For years and years, builders like Carillion have continued to tender for jobs, knowing full well it's going to cost them more. And then they enter this thing, I don't know if you're aware of it, they call it value engineering.
Yeah.
It's the buzzword.
I discovered it to my shame, because I'd like to have known about it before after Grenfell, when people were explaining to me why the cladding that had originally been approved was actually replaced by something that was cheaper but still passed some criteria or test. That's the same sort of thing, isn't it?
Exactly the thing. So I work for a manufacturer, so we go and see an architect, and we provide them with details to build a building, in effect. And then there's a phrase which is it's part of European law, but I'm an avid Remainer, but what people will say is something called equal or approved. So basically, as long as someone signs off you can use that thing, then it gets used. And no one really knows who that person should be. So it could be the architect, it could be the client. Anyway, getting back to the Carillion thing.
Yeah.
It's just they've just done it for years and years, and they work on this premise. You've got the big 5 or 6 builders, and they go to contractors and say, if you don't do this job, you'll never work for us again. They don't pay people. They pay people in 120 and 150 days.
Yeah, I've heard that.
And the government have known about this, and they have promised continually to do it. And what it means, and it's basically cash flow that. Yeah, and, you know, Chris Grayling is my local MP, and everything he seems to touch turns to, you can insert your own finish.
Yeah.
But
he is astonishing, isn't he? Even by the standards of this government, Grayling is an absolute walking catastrophe who keeps walking away scot-free. It's incredible. Prisons, he's the one that banned books in prisons, isn't he, when he had a crack at justice? What an absolute melt.
I always joke to people, he's officially the person I've met with the weakest handshake, and I always get told by many people never to trust someone with a weak handshake.
You make me miss my dad now when you do that, you silly old sausage. It's all right, Ray, carry on.
But with regards to that, I mean, what they need to look at now is these government tenders that are in place and say, have you priced it realistically? Because it's
And what's in it for them? Just an easier life? Is it we can massage the figures to claim that we've cut public spending because we're paying this contract, even though we'll end up paying more by the time the reality emerges. The news agenda will have moved on, and no one's going to go back and publish the results of the value engineering. They're only going to publish the results of the original bid, and also a degree of buck passing, so that as long as things are going badly, it doesn't really reach the government's door until things go this badly wrong, and then the government gets a massive wake-up call.
I think the first time I become aware is unfortunately with Labour's building schools for the future, where there's ridiculous thing that we're going to build every school, no matter even if it was built 7 years ago. And then you start handing out packages of 7 or 8 schools to builders, which are, you know, hundreds of millions. So then if you start shaving 1% off, and they shave that 1% through, excuse the term, screwing over subcontractors, nailing down people on prices of products, because unfortunately with capitalism come these big egos, and what people thrive on is the turnover of their company. So you continually...
It's the commercial equivalent of GDP. We sit here being told our GDP has gone up. We're the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world, but many people feel skint, and 17 million people have only got haven't got 100 quid's worth of savings in the bank. But somehow that's irrelevant because GDP is good. It's the same with turnover on a commercial level. We're screwing over our subcontractors. Our staff haven't had a pay rise for 3 years. Morale's gone through the floor. Half of them are working on 0 hours, but the turnover's gone up, so it's trebles all round in the boardroom.
And it's, you know, hundreds of David Brent type phrases regarding turnover and profit and all the rest of it. But it is the thing of You know, I've worked with subcontractors who say, I turn over this much and I work, and then they name the big 5 builders, and it's you know, you can't accuse people of brown envelopes, but if you ever wanted to look into the UK construction industry,
you're not the first person to tell me that, and planning arrangements and councils and all those sort of things as well would merit a little bit of closer scrutiny. It's another crisis of journalism, actually. It's not just your business that's got questions to answer, David. It's mine as well. Of course.
Just for one more second, if you look at, I mean, linking it back to affordable housing, because it's the same thing. Yeah. How can you you make provision for affordable housing, and then you go to someone and say, well, I don't want to do that, but I'll give you some money instead. That is as legalised brown envelopes as you can possibly.
We're back to Kensington and Chelsea again.
Yes.
And elsewhere. So, I mean, I suppose to be the voice of reason, I should stress that it depends what you spend that money on. But if there's no legal requirement to spend that money on affordable housing very, very near to the development that has ducked its responsibilities to affordable housing by writing a cheque instead, then you've got a whole heap of problems. But this is my problem as professionally, is that when I speak to people like you, and you know, I'd always rather speak to someone like you than some sort of industry spokesperson or an undersecretary minister who's been in the job for 6 minutes, because you clearly know what you're doing. You must tear your hair out if you've got any left, because it's so obvious to you on a daily basis, and yet people like me only wake up to it when it is arguably too late after a collapse of a construction firm like Carillion.
Well, it's just part and parcel of it. You know, if we sit to bore you for 1 minute, if we sit down with an architect and we go to our bosses and say, it's brilliant, we've been specified to be, you know, there's a big hospital in Brighton, for example, it means nothing, because you know, ultimately, the other the phrase you might have is a what they call a design and build contract.
Yes.
So you tender for the work, and then you basically employ your own architect. So
to cut the costs as much as possible, with you keeping the balance.
And the architect.
This is not Marxism, mate. This is not communist. This isn't the Jeremy Corbyn fan club. This is two people who have a vague understanding of the issues in my case and a deeper understanding of the issues in another case, simply describing the daily reality of your working life, David, right?
Yeah, but what it does, it gets away from the bureaucracy. Just one very quick example. My daughter's school had an extension block being done. So they went to the local authority and said, it'll cost us £900,000 to do it, and we'll put it through the process and you'll get it. Or you can run it yourself and we'll give you £1.3 million to deliver it. So then you've got a head teacher who's never worked in construction and basically a government committee dealing with a project manager. The builder come in, they went bankrupt. The first we knew about is when I said to a deputy head, what's happening? And he said, well, no one's been on site for 10 days. The builder had gone under because they had over capacity in government contracts, and then it ended up costing about 1.6 million because the next builder come in and said, well, we can't deliver it for that. So it went from 900,000 to 1.6 million.
Trebles all round.
So, but
mind how you go, David.
Thanks, James.
It's 11:15, very nearly. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Is there a positive analysis of this? I mean, the notion that this is... Can someone put a spin on it? I enjoyed David's call particularly because he's speaking of precisely the environment in which he lives and works, but also because he reminded us of Labour culpability on similar issues. I think we've got to do that in 2018. I don't know how it's going to work, and a lot of very lonely missions have started on this programme that have slowly gathered a little bit more pace across the country in the last couple of years. I don't just mean the kind of withdrawal of government policy as a result of our interventions. I just mean a change in how we look at things. We've got to stop looking at everything like football fans, haven't we? We've got to put the national interest ahead of party political loyalties. The problem is, of course, that Brexit is the single most binary issue of our age, possibly ever in the history of Western politics. It could be the most binary issue. Therefore, can we possibly work together if we're on separate sides of that argument about what the future should look like? Because you don't need me to remind you that the chairman of Carillion was among 100 big business chiefs who signed a letter to the Telegraph warning that Brexit would threaten jobs and deter investment. So even if, like me, you consider Brexit to be the single biggest act of national self-harm since... probably since the big Endians went to war against the little Endians halfway through Gulliver's Travel. I don't want Carillion to get a free pass on this. I don't want this fella to be able to turn around and say, oh, well, I did warn you. about Brexit, because that way Brexit becomes the new immigration. So all of the problems caused by domestic political incompetence that have historically been blamed on the European Union wrongly in order to let the government off the, oh, it's because of immigration. Yeah, hospitals, immigration, schools, immigration. Brexit could become the new one. Businesses collapsing, unemployment, share price. Oh, yeah, it's all because of Brexit. It's all because of Brexit. At what point do politicians who have been elected to do a job actually take responsibility for the failure to do that job? Answers on a postcard. And it is probably just a waste of everybody's time, isn't it? Us doing this kind of journalism in the modern climate of this country. Speaking to people who are informed, who base their position upon evidence, who explain that the Carillion catastrophe was not only visible from 100 miles away, but so visible that hedge funds made millions and millions of pounds out of predicting it, including the biggest winner of all, a hedge fund that was co-founded by one of the Leave campaign's biggest backers. And the planets are now aligning, but as we established on Friday with regard to Brexit, it doesn't matter, because the big disconnect between the two factions of the British public is half of them really need to know what is going to happen next before they can decide whether it is a good idea to give up what is happening now, and the other half don't care what happens next. And it's impossible to really explain this without sounding rude, but I presume, as we discovered on Friday, it doesn't actually reach your ears as rude if this is you that I'm describing now. You are so persuaded that what we've got is so rotten that you don't care what comes next as long as we get rid of what we've got now. We drive the car to the scrapyard and we stick it in the crusher, and only then do we start worrying about how we're going to get home. And I get that now in a way that I never got before. So, talking about Carillion in this fashion, talking about government handing billions of pounds towards a company that was already hemorrhaging share prices and senior executives, a company that had already changed the rules of its own pay policies to protect £4 million worth of bonuses paid to precisely those executives who fell on their swords when the share price collapsed, when an accountancy crisis kicked in, and then within days they're trousering £1.4 billion contracts from the government. And the chairman was until, well, according to number 10, until December 2016, the chairman was advising the Prime Minister on corporate responsibility. But I am, and they are, because I've asked them repeatedly, utterly unable to find any reference to that announcement. There's an obscure blog. I hope I'm not offending anyone by saying that it's an obscure blog, which appears to have got a letter from the MP Margot James, carefully worded, and stating that Philip Green no longer holds the position of advisor to the Prime Minister on corporate social responsibility. But I'm not going to lie to you, and you have to promise not to laugh. I'm struggling to download it because I'm not very good with computers. James is in Cardiff. James, what would you like to say about Carillion?
Oh, hiya, James.
Hello.
I'm just giving this from a slightly different viewpoint, I suppose. I've worked in the contracting industry and the housing market all my life. And a number of years ago, I had a medium-sized contracting business, which I lost control of due to the administration of another large contracting company, which went into administration, Connaught, which was a number of years ago.
Yes.
Similar kind of company to Carillion. And in truth, you know, yet again, we don't learn by our mistakes in this country. The contracting business out there and the housing market is a broken system. It's controlled by very few, you know, not enough companies. You know, I lost £250,000 when Connaught went into administration, so I was
money they owed you for work done, or money that was in the order book. Doesn't really matter, does it?
Money that actually, if you include order book, I probably lost about £1.5 million.
Well, you sound quite cheerful, considering, James.
It's a couple of years ago now.
Must be a choice of radio programme. Keeps a smile on your face.
It's listening to you. and actually, you know, and this is actually probably the big thing. So I was a contracting business that had around about 30, 40 guys working for me. Admittedly, not all on the books. Some of them subcontracting.
Yes.
I now don't have that business anymore.
It kicks back and it kicks back and it kicks back, and so the hedge. How naive does it sound for me to say from my student union political platform that if you're wondering where all the money that should have made its way into your coffers and the coffers of your subcontractors and your employees has gone, have a look at how many people made money out of betting on the company collapsing.
Well, I think there's in part some truth behind that. I actually see that, though, contracting, you don't fail in contracting until the train arrives at the station and you realise it's empty.
Yes.
Because effectively, contracting lives off cash flow. You don't live off margin. You're living off cash flow. That's all you're living off. And it's not until a job gets delayed or one gets prolonged or you can't start on something when you thought you could, that all of a sudden the wheels start falling off. And the wheels fall off really quickly, actually, because if you're, when I had my contracting business, my wage bill was about 30, 40 grand a week. And you need 30, 40 grand a week to survive. If you can lose control of a business within a month. If you don't pay your men, men just don't turn up to work. That is it. And when I heard Carillion issues a couple of weeks or a couple of months ago, back in July, and then you've heard it drip and drab, and I suppose I follow it quite intensely, actually, because it's something that interests me.
Yeah.
There was something that they were mentioning, saying they're trying to sort this out with the banks, and I was thinking, if Carillion have got a £500 million issue today because they got to pay their suppliers or whatever it may be, they just doubled their issue, because all of their suppliers are going to want pro forma payment. No one's going to do anything. Everyone's going to down tools because you're owed 120 days worth of money. You're already in for a lot of money. Why expose more? And it's complete, and I think this is the important thing on this, James, is that, and actually the real reason for my call, it's the procurement process which is wrong. And your actual last caller touched upon it. When they're going out to build a school and you've got rates coming in and there's somebody who can build it for 10 million, but then you've got somebody who can build it for 7, there should be a thought process that is sat behind it, thinking, we're going to award this to somebody who's saying that you can do it for £2.5 million cheaper. That's going one way. And dare I say it, the house, as I call them, the house bashers, the big house builders, have got the same mentality.
Yes.
And the issue is that the margin is being taken out of the industry. And it's not correct. And it can only go one way. It can only fail.
Well, that's what I'm hearing from you, and it's odd that you've concluded like that, because you've answered the question I was about to ask you, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Here's a prison, right? This is what I've learned from my callers today, and my God, I'm so blessed and privileged to have callers like you listening to the programme. Here's a prison that needs a maintenance contract, and that has gone to Carillion. But Carillion then pay a local company to do the maintenance of the prison.
Absolutely.
Which means that a slice has been taken out of that pie before the pie even gets delivered to the prison. And the maintenance company that's turning up at the prison to fix the windows or do the painting job is doing so on a bare bones budget because of the money that's already made its way into Carillion's coffers for the job of literally divvying up the work that they've bid to do. So that's why it was bound to go wrong, because how can that possibly be better? I understand economies of scale. I'm not completely stupid. I went to the LSE. But how can that be better than the prison governor procuring locally the company that could provide the service, the contract that they've got?
And you're...
Would it ever have happened like that? Or indeed, it being part of the Home Office's remit, and they have on the staff, or they have contracts with the companies directly, if you need to go back to central government, it's bringing in this middleman who gets paid every single time he turns a page.
Well, and I think the issue is on that, though, and again, it comes back down to procurement.
It does, doesn't it?
My contracting business probably turned over, I don't know, we got up to around about £12 million a year turnover.
Yeah.
Now the issue is on that, and the issue is that there becomes this point where you can't get bigger.
Yeah.
Because you can't move up that pyramid, you can't get up further up the pyramid, because
it's like my Piranha. My BMX Piranha had a speed limiter on it, so however hard you pedal, there was a point at which you could go no faster.
That's right.
King of the analogies.
I had a grifter. I didn't have a Piranha.
Oh, get you.
but if you're trying to make your way up that triangle, you can't be 12 million to 15 million turnover.
Oh, yeah.
You need to go 12 to 24.
Right.
And there becomes a point, and it's
which you do by mergers and acquisitions more than anything else.
You do. You very rarely do you grow a business. You know,
how can we increase our turnover? We need to spend some of the money we made last year on buying another company and adding their turnover to our turnover.
You can grow a business to 8 million quid.
Yeah.
And contracting, but the problem is with that, though, and this is I think this is the important thing. You almost become a bit of an addict.
Yes.
Because and
it's a Ponzi scheme. It's not a Ponzi scheme, but you need to keep bringing in money to inflate.
Yeah.
To keep the thing moving. I'm very late for the news. Give me your crucial conclusion.
It's just that once you're stuck in a system, you can't get out.
And that seems to be. Yeah, you all right now? After you, as I say, you sound pretty chipper. I presume you've got other businesses that are flourishing.
I managed to get myself through it. I don't know contracting. I'm now a consultant, so I can consult on housing and regeneration schemes. So I'm now a standalone. I used to have people work for me, and I now have a mobile phone in a car. I've never been happier.
I was going to say, I presume that has had an impact upon how your shoulders feel every morning. 11, although personally I'd rather have people like James still involved in this process of procurement and supply than some of the people who've presided over the collapse of Carillion while hedge funds made millions. I know sometimes you think I make this stuff up, and it's days like today when you just you briefly have to go, oh, God, he's right. And then tomorrow we can all go back to blaming foreign aid for everything. Are we taking these two calls? I thought we were going to move on to the alcohol conversation, but if you feel that Tom and Ian's contributions are so valuable that we would be denied if we don't hear from them, then I'm happy to take advisement on this one. OK, we'll take a couple more calls on Carillion. The reason that I would move on is because I suspect we'll be talking about it for a little bit longer, and I suspect that Sheila will be weighing in imminently as well. But now that I've given Tom and Ian a name check, it would be very rude of me and a little bit unfair not to take their calls. So after Tom and Ian, we'll crack on with something else, I think. Tom is in Warlingham. Tom, what would you like to say?
Thanks for taking the call, James, and thanks for doing this morning. I think it's
wasting my breath, mate. Wasting my breath and your time. It'll all be back to foreign aid tomorrow.
Well, I mean, I think the sad thing is this is the first of a very large number of dominoes.
Lord.
I know of at least one other fairly major contractor who will go within the next 2 months. A report from Moore Stephens, the cost and risk analysis last year, said that 26% of construction companies are at risk of going bust.
Why? I mean, I know that I'm asking you to praise a big, complicated analysis, but what were the headline reasons?
Well, it isn't that complicated.
Oh.
Your last caller was actually bang on the money. Companies have been living off cash flow for years and years and years. There is no such thing as margin, if you like, in construction, because again,
well, how are they paying dividends then? How are shareholders walking away with all this money?
Well, then that's a different matter entirely, and that's where you look at it and you think, how can this be going on? How can they be skating on such thin ice and paying their chief executives these multi-million-pound bonuses, paying their shareholders? And then you look at pension funds. Oh, hang on a minute, we're £800 million short.
How much is Carillion short? 680, I think.
Yeah, 680.
Where the hell did I pluck that number from? I must have read it earlier today.
Impressive.
Yeah, isn't it?
It's
just,
impressive.
That's why you're tuning in, mate.
Well, that's why I always tune in, James. It's what they're doing also is they're putting the screw to the smaller contractors and to the manufacturers like the company I work for. There's two things that you'll see on any sort of tender document. One is MCD, which is main contractor discount. Now,
what does that mean?
Well, this was brought in a number of years ago to encourage main contractors to pay their subcontractors on a reasonable timescale. Yes. And the theory was that if they paid in a certain timescale, they could deduct 2.5% from the charges. And it was, as I say, it was encouraged to get them to pay on time. Over the years, that kind of evaporated, and they were claiming the 2.5% regardless. And in some cases, although 2.5% is, if you like, in inverted commas, the legal figure, they were claiming a lot more. And the subcontractors were, if not happy to do it, but because it helped them to win the contracts, they would suck it up. And sometimes it got into double digits.
And the MCD then makes a profit on the profit by keeping it in. I mean, I know interest rates are low at the moment, but they get to earn interest on it in the interim.
Still no profit. there's still no profit because, again, as your previous caller said, let's say a job is worth, in Carillion's terms, let's say it's worth 50 million. It goes out to the marketplace to be bid, and let's say Carillion go in at 40 million.
Yeah.
So they're already, theoretically, on the specified job making a £10 million loss. That's where the value engineering comes in. That's where they go out and think, OK, this brick is specified, this tile is specified, this glass is specified. I'm going to put in a slightly lower spec product, which is going to save me X amount. I'll get it past the architects, and I'm making my money. Trouble is, 20 years ago, that 10 million that they were getting back, that was profit for them. Now, because they're underbidding on the contracts, they have to do that just to get the jobs in. And as your previous caller said, cash flow is king. But there's another thing called retentions, which you might be aware of.
Go on.
Anytime a contractor wins a job, especially in the government market, but elsewhere as well, there'll be a retentions period on the job. And that means that those contractors will, for at least a period of 2 years or more, have withheld some of their payment against the building being defective.
Yeah.
You might recall a job, I think it was in Highbury, a swimming pool that was built that turned out to leak like everything.
Yes.
Exactly. So it's there for whoever's paying for the job to say, well, hang on, you've done a great job, here's your retention after 2 years, or no, you've done a bad job, you're keeping the retention. Again, because companies now are underbidding jobs so badly, it is less likely they're going to get their retention payments. So again, they're going
and who carries the can?
Well,
everybody listening to this programme is going to be thinking two things. They're going to be thinking, God grief, he's not exaggerating for once when he talks about the calibre and the quality of his callers. But they're also going to be thinking, if it's so obvious, all I can think of in terms of corporate misbehaviour would be Fred Goodwin losing his knighthood and those fellas from Guinness ending up in jail until they claimed they had Alzheimer's and they got out, and then their Alzheimer's miraculously got cured. That's all I can think of. I know, and then Assel Nadir running off to Northern Cyprus. Who carries the can? Who will get slapped for this?
It's a very good question, and I'm not sure I have an answer.
Shut the front door.
What will happen is Carillion will go bust. There'll be inquiries, public or otherwise. People will be hung out to dry, some of them validly, some of them invalidly. And 5 years from now, you'll Google their names, and lo and behold, they'll be on the board of a different construction.
Non-executive directors, and guess who will be sitting alongside them on those boards? People who are currently sitting in the cabinet.
Yes.
Finally, is this a bit, because I can't help hearing echoes, and I've got a slightly magpie brain, so I may have misunderstood this one. When Lord Adonis described Chris Grayling as having given Brian Souter and Richard Branson billions of pounds worth of public money after they failed to deliver on something, this sounds quite similar now to me.
Well, this is in effect, I think, what was being asked for over the weekend.
Yes.
If you, the government, don't pay us this money, we're going pop. The government, on the face of it, has said, no, we're not going to. You're going to have to go bust. What may happen is that those funds will still come from the taxpayer to shore up the contracts. Because when a company goes bust in the middle of a contract, let's say, in Carillion's case, Liverpool Hospital, someone's going to have to come in and take that contract over.
Yeah.
The very act of tendering that's going to put the costs of that up. And then, of course, miraculously, that contractor will come in and they'll say, oh, who are the cowboys who built this? We've got much more work to do than we thought. It's going to cost X amount more. But if I've got one more point.
Quickly.
You'll like this one a lot. Brexit is really key as to why Carillion have gone right now. Because
stone him, burn him.
Yes, because they were already up a certain river without a certain implement. But what's pushed them over the edge, of course, is the change in the value of sterling. So the margins have got tighter and tighter because import costs have gone up. That's hit smaller contractors' profitability as well. It means there's less access to bank lending. And again, as your excellent previous caller just said, what's happening now is some of the smaller contractors are going around to people like Carillion and saying, look, you are in terrible trouble.
Yes.
We're not willing to extend you even 30 days credit. We want pro forma. We want 50% of the value of the contract up front.
Got you.
Now, of course, Carillion are right to say no, go away, we'll go to someone else. But the trouble is, no one else is going to give it to them either. And
that's the dominoes. That's the dominoes right there.
That's the domino. And Carillion, the sad thing is this will take down numerous smaller firms. But
well, let's all hope not, although your analysis is pretty compelling, as was James in Cardiff and David earlier. Why can't we put you three in charge? You could be like the Musketeers of public sector procurement.
I've been in this industry 20 years. It's never been as risky or as bad as it is now. Carillion is only the first. Will any of the other big six go? I don't think so, because I think they're slightly better managed. But if you like the tranche of ones below that, the next 20, 5, 6, 7 of those within 2 years could easily be gone.
And on that happy note, Tom, thank you very much indeed. I had a zinger question for the end of it that I was really looking forward to asking him, but he's knocked the stuffing out of me with that analysis. Where would you go for the positives? Where would you go for the, calm down, it's not? I appreciate some people are going to balk at the suggestion that it is linked to Brexit and the fact that you now have to pay a lot more for any raw materials coming from either the Eurozone or other markets is going to be part of it, and the fact that the chairman and the chief executive both warned that Brexit was going to damage Carillion. I appreciate some people want to pretend that, well, not pretend, they want to continue believing that warnings about this happening had nothing to do with the thing that they said was linked to it, and I'm oddly sympathetic towards you today. I don't want Brexit to become an excuse for corporate mismanagement. If Carillion goes under, and Tom posits the notion the other 5 struggle but survive, then they've all been affected by Brexit, but Carillion was the one that went under, so the people responsible for that deserve a kicking. And yet, when I marvel slightly at the state of British politics, I do find myself wondering whether the people... No, I mean, how far would you go back on this? I've mentioned Guinness, Polly Peck. You've got Fred Goodwin over at the RBS. I think he lost his knighthood, but he's still got a moat round his house. Like, where are... And then the relationship between actions and consequences. And you think back to that coverage of the story involving the alleged journalist Toby Young last week and his removal from that board, which wasn't because of rude tweets he sent about women's breasts, really. In the final analysis, when the Conservative MPs like Robert Halfon and Sarah Wollaston and Heidi Allen joined in, it was because of his discriminatory comments about children with special educational needs and disabled people. But the right-wing media are already trying to turn it into something that it isn't. Well, people like me and you, I suspect, think, how can we teach our children that actions have consequences if the most prominent people in public life routinely mess up and end up getting promoted or rewarded? There's a name for that. I believe it's known in the business as grayling. Take this up to 12, which wasn't the original intention, but I have to tell you that I have... sometimes when you say something quite often, you find yourself wondering whether you should say it less often in the context of how good my callers are. I can't. I'll say it when it's true, but some days it's even more true than on other days. And today is one of those days where the callers to this programme since 10 o'clock this morning have provided me with a better understanding and knowledge of the Carillion collapse and the attendant issues and the fact that this may well prove to be the beginning of a process rather than the end of a process than I managed to get from all of the business pages of all of the national newspapers and from the BBC's experts earlier this morning. That really is a credit to you. I've got very little to do with it. I'm just the ringmaster. People like Ian are the elephants. Ian, what would you like to dance on today?
Hi, yeah. I'm just coming at it from a slightly different point of view. I mean, I don't have anything personally to do with Carillion, but my sister did.
Right.
Up until about, between a year and 18 months ago.
Okay.
She bailed out because she saw, not necessarily the way it was going up to this point today, but she had a really tough time.
Yes.
Because she was getting more and more work piled on top of her. They were understaffed. When she was on holiday, she was having to do work there and so on and so on. And, she was being treated very, 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 very poorly. And, it's interesting when he said when he asked the question, how can they fail when they're getting all these contracts? And so on and so on. And that question is also relevant when it comes to their staffing issues. Probably, how can they fail to make money when they're probably not providing enough staff numbers to actually get on with the job in hand?
And this is what worries me, to be honest, because it is clearly... I think that the reason why no one's wrong today, even from the kind of lunatic fringe of British politics, which is normally massively overrepresented on this programme, no one's attempting to defend this or spin it, or yet no one's trying to say that it could all have been avoided if we didn't spend so much money on foreign aid, although I expect that will happen in the next few days. What worries me about your analysis is that if we chalk it up to bad management and bad running, it doesn't pop the ideological balloon. It allows these people to still say, oh, well, no, just because Carillion went wrong doesn't mean the whole process of outsourcing public sector contracts and letting these people run prisons and schools and hospitals is wrong. We just had the wrong people in charge. So if it's all right with you, Ian, we'll crack on with privatising the NHS.
Yeah, well, you see, they also forget what happened in the 2012 Olympics when G4S screwed up with the security, and of course it was the public sector who had to bail them out.
Yes, it always will be. So what's that phrase that I used to think was a little bit glib but now seems to resonate with uncommon poignancy? You socialise the losses.
Yes, that's it.
Capitalise the profits, or
yes.
Oh, it's a bit pithier than that. But I can't remember what it is. The idea is that when one of these outfits makes a loss, that gets socialised, that gets spread out among the whole population. Yeah. But when they get a profit, that makes its way into the pockets of a very, very small number of people. And who carries the can? Who does it end up with? Arguably, people living in places like Grenfell Tower. When the cold, hard reality of these processes emerges, it can be as horrible and as traumatic as that.
Yeah, that's often the case, yes.
I don't know what we're going to talk about next, Ian.
Well, no, but...
Booze or funerals, mate. I'm supposed to be trying to cheer people up a bit in the final hour of the programme. I'd leave that with me. That's my lookout. I hope your sister's in a better place. The story that I was intending, if I had to, if I felt that this ship hadn't sailed successfully, I was going to try and revivify the Carillion conversation with a story about delivery drivers for Amazon getting £20,000 in back pay because they were wrongly described as self-employed. This from the GMB union, which was preparing to take an employment tribunal case on behalf of a group of drivers in the Midlands working for a company called UK Express, a logistics company that delivers for Amazon. So the next level of the Carillion conversation for me would have been trying to establish whether or not the logistics arms and other of Carillion saw people being described as self-employed, so that even more of the responsibilities and rights that you'd expect the workforce to have in this context would have been removed or even non-existent in the first place. But I don't know, and we didn't need to. But wrongly defined as self-employed instead of employees means that you get denied, you get cheated is the word I'd use, of your entitlement to paid annual leave, the national minimum wage, paid rest breaks and protection from unfair dismissal. It's almost as if all the strands are coming together now, but a significant swathe of the country isn't going to notice because they're still obsessing, of course, about Brexit. And there was one more comment to make about Brexit, which I can't find. So we will move on to something completely different in the final hour.